Welcome to the Creative Industry Insight podcast, a podcast that looks at various roles in the creative world. I'm your host, Bobby. Today's guest, producer, director, and writer, Dorsay Alavi, joins us to talk about their work on the documentary Wayne Shorter Zero Gravity. Please be warned, there are heavy spoilers in this episode, so sit back and relax as we jump into the conversation with Dorsay. Hi, Dorsay. Thank you for joining me today.
Hello, it's good to be here.
We've got you on to talk about Wayne Shorter Zero Gravity documentary, which is going to be streaming on Amazon, 3-part series, which will be out on August the 25th. I managed to get an early screener. Thank you very much to the team behind that for sorting that out. I feel like I'm part of some sort of like exclusive club now by getting screeners.
You are. People are dying. They're fighting for those screeners.
So I know Danielle is with us at the moment, so thank you for sorting that out, and to the whole team, Adriana and Alex, for sorting that out for me and sorting out interview with you as well, Dorsay. So I really appreciate for that. So I think we should start from the beginning. How did the project come about? Because in my research, I've noticed that you've directed and produced a music video for Wayne himself, and then there's also a live event as well. This like relationship that you guys have had is probably something that's been there for nearly 30 years.
Yes, exactly. So it's been a passion project, but a very personal one. And we started talking about it in 2004, and I just started documenting as early as that. But it wasn't really until 2013 that we were raising funds and started diving into the documentary. And it just sort of grew and grew and grew. And I became a much bigger thing. And I realized I was suddenly the keeper of Wayne's life story, which was a real honor and a privilege that he trusted me so much.
I think when you start doing a documentary about someone's life and they've lived such a full and rich life, there must be so much in terms of like research and questions asking, because somebody like Wayne has passed away this year, has lived in so many sort of different times, and not necessarily just like in terms of years, but in terms of movements and how the world's progressed in terms of music and art. So there must have been so much to sort of dive into his life. And I guess like in the documentary that is in 3 parts, how do you go about choosing what you want to add to the story, and how do you divide the episodes up?
Well, it didn't always start as a series. It started as a feature. And as I started to delve into Wayne's life, I was much more interested in Wayne as a human being first, and then how it informed his music. So I started from that aspect because I knew him personally. He's a fascinating human being, and I wanted to show how that informed his music, but also how he grew to greatness through adversity in his life. So for me, what led me was I had a lot of time, personal time with Wayne, but I was sort of this conduit. Just whatever came through me was a reflection of what I had observed through all the years and what I had acquired through knowledge through the many people who knew him and who had collaborated with him, and his family members and friends and his Buddhist community. They all participated in the telling of his story. And as I was putting this together, as you know, in documentaries, a lot of this comes together in the editorial room. So when I started putting this together, I started realizing that this is a much bigger story. This is not a 2-hour feature film. This is a man's entire life, the breadth of his life in 3 pivotal periods. And that's how I came up with the portals. So each portal reflects a time period that was most meaningful to Wayne and the music. And so that's, if you see it at the beginning, it's his childhood until his late 20s. Portal 2 is his 30s and 40s. And then Portal 3 is, at that time, it was present day. So I thought, this gives a real picture of who this man is, and also reflects how profound and prolific his body of work was.
What quite struck me as well with the whole portal idea and going by certain time periods is the running themes of things that he's always been interested in. So films being a really big part of his childhood, where him and his brother would stay up after watching films to sort of talk and walk through scenes past their bedtime and try to recount what they've seen. And I kind of like picture it back to my childhood a little bit, because we used to do that. We'd watch films in the cinema and then come back and then talk about it and play them out and play our favorite scenes, or even like talk about certain things that we might have liked. Well, sometimes I'm pretty certain I might have been a bit too young to be watching one or two of the films that my parents took us to, but it's neither here or there. But what I do like about that is like it feels like something where there's a creative awakening of Wayne, and you start to see it throughout the portals. And what I love as well is when people are saying that his music feels like there's scenes playing out, and that they're scenes of like a film or a show, but in the form of music, and it just connects to you such a different manner.
Yes, well, he always would say, I'm making movies without pictures. And, that early impression, he was an early cinephile, and he remained one throughout his life because he also was such a visual artist. And so pictures elicited sounds for him. And when he saw an image, he could hear the sound, which is really unusual to be visual and oral at the same time. And so, as Joni also talks about, he's pictorial in the notes that he plays and writes. And so he was always creating a motion picture with everything that he wrote or played. And it's true. He could watch movies from morning till night. It was a big part of his life.
That's literally living the dream. I wish I could do that in my life. But in terms as well, like, because music is so different to films, and in terms of like the tone and like pitch that people would use in their songs, but it's also you've seen in studies that like music hits so differently that if somebody's not responsive, but if you play music, there'll still be some sort of function, or your brain can connect to that. And what amazes me is that like if you close your eyes when you listen to Wayne's music, I feel like sometimes you might be an episode of a Twilight Zone, for example, in that sort of like barren wasteland, or being in that sort of like atmospheric sort of vibe. And I don't feel like you get that too much with music these days, unfortunately.
A lot of that is Wayne is actually having a dialogue with his listener. He's raising your frequency with the sounds that he creates. And beyond the five senses, he's having this, it's underneath all of it, but it's having a profound effect on people, whether they know it or not. A lot of times people would go to a concert when he was playing with his quartet going, I don't know what that was, but oh my God, I feel completely transformed afterwards. And his mission was always to, through sound, give people hope, let them know that they are free beings and they are the masters of their own destiny. He wants to instill those ideas through his music and through the sounds he creates.
Yes, and I think what struck me as well later on, which you see in Portal 3, is how many that after so many years of him performing, is that how many young people are still in the audience and connecting to his music. That's something that really sort of struck me, because it was like, wow, like no matter what sort of decade Wayne's playing in, there's still people coming to flock to see him, people my age and younger. And he has like that sort of 4-quadrant audience base. And that really comes off well in the documentary as well, because because of the way that he sort of discusses music and how he's playing it. When it comes to capturing those sort of moments where he is sort of talking about music and the audiences, and then the sort of change, and it's the same with when he's talking about when he joins another band and talks about Miles Davis. How would you say, as a director, would you want to sort of capture those moments on screen? Because you don't want it just to be talking heads, but you've also added in stock footage, and also footage from previous shows. How do you go about sort of collating those together to make it sort of fluid and interesting for the viewer to watch?
First of all, I didn't have very much footage to work with to begin with. There was a very large period of time where it wasn't any documented footage of Wayne. especially his early years. So a lot of those were recreated. And also I wanted, rather than, it's exactly right, I didn't want a bunch of talking heads. I wanted this to actually feel like a narrative film, not like a documentary. I wanted people to become immersed in that time period, in that portal. And how I did that was I also allowed the music to play, because the music in itself was another character in the film. And I felt that most documentaries, sometimes they're so busy talking about the music, you're never listening to it. You're just hearing about, how it was made, what it did. I wasn't interested in that. I wanted people to actually experience Wayne's music. And so a lot of the animation and the visual compositing that I did was to allow you to connect to the music visually, just like Wayne wanted you to. So a lot of that was there for you to experience the music. His collaborations, there was great concert footage later on with Blakey and Miles Davis and some weather report. So I had chosen pieces of music that I felt showcased Wayne's influence on those bands that he played as a sideman. And then obviously the footage that I recreated with the young 20-something Wayne Shorter was for everything that he was doing as a lead, as his own, they were his own compositions. So I tried to do the best that I could in terms of creating very genuine experiences with what I had.
Okay, I think there's times where you have recreations as well, which I think are quite play out really well with what's being said on the overlay, and they complement what the story is being told by Wayne to what's appearing on screen. And I think having certain concert footage, it feels weird. Not weird's not the right word. I think when you have the concert footage from a certain time, it's always, I find it quite fascinating to see in terms of just how they're performing and what the crowd is like, just because it could be from a time, the era that I wasn't born in. So it's always sort of fascinating to have that sort of feel of like the decade and whatnot.
Yeah, exactly.
When you're doing a documentary about a musician and about someone, there will be certain things that will be brought up. So, for example, like a personal life. How do you go about being respectful to the person that you're doing the documentary about? So, in Wayne's case, but also sort of trying to get that information out in how certain life experiences and aspects that have happened for him to open up and to sort of get a more human element from him.
Well, it's interesting because Wayne generally is a very private person and does not normally talk about his emotions. He has a very bird's eye view of life, but he's obviously an emotional person. But to talk to Wayne about those things, he always came back with an awareness of after the fact. It was hard to, I'll be honest, it was hard to engage him and be direct about how it emotionally impacted him. But for some reason, when I looked back at the footage and we were having this dialogue with each other about what had happened, that emotion really comes through in the interview. It comes through in his behavior and the expression, but not so much in the words. And there were many times when I asked Wayne, he had to watch the film, and there were sometimes some things that people said were not easy for him to hear. And at one point he did question, like, do we need to have that in there? And I said, yes. And his wife, Carolina, was very helpful with that. It was very important to have a full picture. The good, the bad, and the ugly needed to be represented as a part of his life, because that's human. We can't just show the reverent pieces of Wayne Shorter's life. I think that would be an incomplete documentary and portrayal of his life. So when presented like that, he seemed to be okay with it. And I have always maintained that it just made Wayne much stronger when you saw what he actually did go through and how he overcame it. And it's much more inspiring to see both together. And I think he embraced it and loved the film in the end.
As being a subject of a documentary, and if he's in being a very personal person that Wayne is, I can imagine that being quite a daunting day or few days that you would have to discuss these things. And on top of that, even though you guys have a close relationship, it's still, I don't know, is very much opening yourself up to certain things that that you haven't talked about before, and it could be very odd as a way to sort of to talk about it and be open about it, especially with certain things that would have happened in his life, and what he has experienced. And I think they're just presented in a way in the film that they're like, for me, there's certain things that happen, without spoiling that hit me really hard, and you do have it, like you have so much sympathy, and there's so much, your heart does go out for Wayne for the things that happen.
Yeah. Portal 2 in particular is a difficult portal because a lot happens in a short span of time. So many blows hit at the same time. And people are usually, by the end of Portal 2, people need a little bit of a rest. I find that when we had the screen, we did a little intermission because people were overtaken by a lot of the emotion that was coming through. But it is interesting because after that, it's Portal 3 that is so bright and inspiring, and you see the transformation from 2 to 3. And I think that's what is very important to Wayne, was important to Wayne, is that you can turn poison into medicine. There's always an opportunity right after the obstacle, the adversity, there's always an opportunity. You really see that in action in Portal 3.
And I think in Portal 3, it has a very, I guess, like as like a human being, certain experiences can really put a damper on how you see on life. But I feel like with Wayne, it kind of, his perspectives changed completely in a way, and
yeah,
you do have that really massive positivity, sort of feel that comes off it, and it radiates off the screen as well.
And his work, all of his music just was completely elevated after that point. Everything in his life, his perspective of life, his spiritual beliefs deepened, his work just even went deeper and broader and bigger ideas, he really wanted to communicate with his audience through sound and took bigger chances. He was always a chance taker, but this was something very different.
In terms of when you're also on top of the sort of focusing on Wayne's life, you'll be focusing on music and different points in his career. We've already mentioned about the crowd and how, even though in later life the crowd was still garnering younger fans and audience. When you're cataloguing his career and going through the sort of motions of who Wayne has worked with and the music that he's producing, do you ever find that the music could also work as a theme in the documentary of the portals, that of the time that we're focusing on, that the theme would be sort of his work with Miles Davis, for example?
Themes, I would say that it was an after effect of the times, because Wayne was always very much aware of what was happening in the world, very attuned to what was happening in the world. And he lived in a time period where it was tumultuous. There was a lot happening, and his way of coping, he was traveling a lot, was he transmitted and reflected and tried to encourage through his music for each time period. I think as a child, it was more whimsical, and he was imagination. It was very important to Wayne. It's remained important in his life. He's driven by ideas, by books. So for me, I think the music, I always just chose pieces that I felt that were clearly identified as what was happening in his life at that time period. And I think with Miles, he wrote a lot of music, as you can see in the documentary, and he influenced everyone that worked with him. Even the band leaders were very influenced by the sounds he was creating.
And even at the time where there's the phone calls where he's talking about how
Miles, Art Blakey and Miles trying to steal.
Yes, yes, thank you. So took the words right out of my mouth. Thank you. Yeah, about stealing my jazz player, and it's just the saxophone player. Sorry, and it's just the sort of way that he recants the story as well. It's just so funny because he's just like, that
Amazing.
that there's some sort of like friendly rivalry there, but there's also just like this is my crew. Leave them alone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Well, they were territorial in those days, because someone like Wayne was a real prize, to find people like Wayne. I mean, he's a rarity and people could feel it and they wanted to hold on to him. And I think for Wayne, it was, he's a very loyal person. So it took a lot, I think, for him to actually leave. But I think he understood that he had to grow. He was always very forward thinking. And even in his later years, he actually was always saying, keep moving forward, don't look backwards. People always wanted to talk about those days about his time with Art Blakey and Miles Davis. And, he had left that. He had moved. So he had surpassed all of that. And he was interested in what was happening today and what he was going to do tomorrow. And that's why young people like him, because he's very present in society today. He was interested in young people. What are they doing? They're going out there doing things. And he wanted to encourage young people to be leaders.
And I think that's always quite inspirational as well, that it's like he's not being guarded over his work or sounds, and sort of more encouraging and pushing people through, sort of elevating them more.
Yeah.
And that's also probably, like, if you think about it, it's a great way to sort of live your life as well, thinking about what you're doing today and tomorrow rather than constantly looking back and not moving forward.
Absolutely. And he does end the film with zero gravity. That's what he means. It's freedom. For him, jazz is not a genre. It's a way of life, a way of being. And for him, jazz is freedom. Freedom and not being influenced by your conditioning or societal conditioning, challenging authority and staying true to what your own personal mission is. And he spoke a lot about the mission, and he encourages people to have their own mission statement in life and to live by it rather than to be dictated to or to follow what people think you should be doing.
And I do love that sort of message from Wayne. What I'm curious about as well is that you're credited as director, producer, and writer. Now, I guess, like, in a traditional sense, I always think of a writer when it comes to films. So they'll write out a script and they'll shoot what's written on a page. But what does it take to write a documentary, and what does it entail?
It starts with the premise of the treatment of how you're going to put the film together, the questions that you construct, then the outlining of transcribing each individual interview, taking pieces. It's almost like an editorial process where you're starting to shape. A lot of the recreations of the little boy, the things he said, those are all written. So there's so much writing involved in documentaries that most people don't know about. It takes a real author to be able to construct the entire film, and you see that there's an arc in the entire film, and that's authorship, and that requires a writer rather than just cutting scenes together. There's a thought process of the questions, the interviews, any additional dialogue, and how you're going to string that narrative together.
It is fascinating to hear that the whole sort of process of writing. And to mention as well, like, no one really realizes that documentaries have writers and how important it is, because you need to build what you want to say, what your story is going to be, and what the structure is, and what the story arc that you would like to tell. But from going through the writing, how many drafts would you say you go through how many drafts would you do of a script for a documentary?
Documentaries don't have one way. I mean, everybody works differently. There are certainly documentaries that don't require a writer, that are more like newsreels. But when you're telling someone's life story, a portrait of someone's life story, I come from a screenwriting background. I'm a screenwriter. So what I did is, for me, the process was, as I was shooting, I was very well aware of what I was going to ask, where the documentary felt instinctively where I wanted it to go, what are the main themes that I want to explore. And there's not a real written script. The questions, the treatment, the cutting in the editing room, the writing in the editing room, that's where the real work is happening. When you're in the editing room, you're doing, the drafts are your rough cut, your fine cut, your fine tuning continually through the processes you're cutting. And you're writing because you're saying, let's move this line here, let's do this here. That is the editorial process. Just like as a writer, you're doing it with the dialogue in the editing room, in the form of interviews.
Going through that, it seems like there's a lot that you have to sort of take consideration, and it feels like it's more, not necessarily a checklist, but it's more of like a great way to find out how you're going to structure your documentary and what you want to do and what questions you want to ask. But on top of that, like, I guess it's also a really good way of you finding the story and what you want to tell of someone's life and what's important and what might not be important as well.
Well, it's the same in narratives. I mean, when you make a film and you write the screenplay, it is essentially a very strong blueprint for the director. So when you're actually shooting the film, you are going to find things in the process as you're making it. You're not going to completely rewrite the script, but it changes so much sometimes from the script by the time the film is released. Documentary is even more, I would say, more versatile in that way. I mean, you really have more to work with because you're not bound by the script. You can discover and you can reshape in that moment. And especially if you start with a radio cut, which Doug Blush, who was our supervising editor, it was something he recommended to me. He said, with something this massive, you want to do a radio cut first. And that radio cut is really just talking heads. And grab the pieces, write it as talking heads first, and then go through and start to build the visuals and everything else. And that was very helpful. It gave me an anchor. It gave me the spine of a script in a way, so I could work from there.
I think it's fascinating as well to hear about editor talking about a radio cut. That's the first time I've ever heard that phrase, and I'm glad you described to us what it meant, because I was slightly lost. I was thinking that it's probably just like a pure audible one, but it's just the talking heads. But when it comes to the sort of post side of it and editing, do you find, like, were there scenes that you loved but you had to take out, and then were there times as well where the story slightly changed in terms of what you wanted to tell because sometimes these scenes might not have worked?
Not so much scenes.
Not scenes, sorry. Interviews. Sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Sure. Here's the thing. We were bound by the idea of what would sell. Okay. We got to a point where we said, so when I finished this doc series was not the thing. Everybody did a feature, unless you were doing some PBS series or Discovery Channel or something like that. It just, people thought, a series is going to be difficult. So we tried to do it as a feature. And I thought, this is just not going to work. It's going to be shallow. This is just, his life is too big for a 2-hour. So for me, a lot of what happened in that process, I had a 4-hour version first. People loved it. Episode from episodes, 4 episodes. But then we had a hard time on the festival. We thought about going to festivals. How are we going to get them to watch a 4-hour? It became a real conversation of how we're going to sell a 4-hour as a feature. So what I did was I had to go in the cutting room and say, okay, let me do a 3-parter. I'll do it as 3 parts. Maybe that's easier. So that process was painful for me because, of course, I loved everything, And, we're filmmakers. We love everything. We're like, this is great. And then we had to make the hard choices of, is this necessary? Is that necessary? Are we saying too much about this? And so we end up cutting those things. And then when you look at it, you go, I didn't even that didn't even, it was not necessary. So it always proves that less is more. As a filmmaker, we want to include everything. But when you really master, I think the master filmmakers are the ones that are lean, simple, and potent. And I think that was challenged with that as a screenwriter. I really understood that. But in documentary form, for some reason, I got very attached. And then when I started cutting away, we started shaving things out and I saw, wow, this is actually stronger without all that information. And sometimes too much information pulls people out. And it was really more important for me to keep people in at all times.
I think you make a good point about the too much information pulling people out. I guess like I do like to watch a lot of documentaries. There's some that you think, man, that could really have been a 4-parter, and then there's others that you could have thought, wow, like that 4 parts could have easily just been a one
2 hours.
Yeah. So then it's like I can imagine that it's such a difficult tightrope to walk, because you want to be like, yeah, I want to do this, but I want to keep this, I want to keep that. And I can imagine it being even harder because you're going through somebody's life. It's so many decades of someone's life that how do I have to cut this down and make it lean for people to enjoy? But then it's like your baby.
And not more them.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily know. I think if it was kept as a 4-parter, it would have been okay. I think that when we tried to cram everything into 3 hours, it just started to belabor it. And I think what I really miss is the scene with Wayne and his daughter, Miyako, and his stepdaughter, Mariana. We never get to see them or show his interaction with them throughout the film. But when we got to the end of it, we realized, gosh, it just slows things down. I had to take it out. So that was one thing that I would have liked to have left in the film. But for some reason, it just wasn't playing right in Portal 3. It was actually in Portal 3.
Do you find as well, like those sort of scenes where I guess you have that more family side of Wayne rather than the musical side? Do you find that at taking that out, I know you said that it slowed it down a little bit and you took it out, but are these times where you kind of mull over it, or sometimes have sleepless nights where you think, I'm going to keep it, and then take it out, keep it, take it out? But at the end of the day, what are the sort of discussions are with the editor about this as well?
I think when I said, I had spoken to my editors, so we had 2 or 3 of them on the project, and some of the producers. When we all mulled it over, we realized that for some reason, the scene wasn't as dynamic as I had hoped for. It was slightly almost awkward, the scene, and it was necessary. It showed an aspect of Wayne, but there was an awkwardness about it that just for some reason felt weighted in that moment. And by Portal 3, and I know Plan B had said this to me, they felt that Portal 3 really felt like an epilogue to them. It's just a sort of, but for me, it was, yes, it was, but it was so current and it was alive and it had a pace to it, a flow to it. And as soon as we got to that scene, it just kind of stopped. And then I was I myself could see it and just said, it's got to go. And it played so much better when it was gone.
Those sort of moments, do you ever think that they were right in the end, even though this is your baby, but it's still that sort of having those discussions with Plan B as well, and trying to fight to keep what you have in, but then also to collaborate with people to make sure that it's correct?
Always. I think it's important that you have people you trust around you as a filmmaker, that that you can go to them and they are going to be very thoughtful in their response. And also be careful who you show your film to very early on. I think you have to be careful not to show it to too many people. And the ones that you do show it to are people that are going to take extra care in how they give you criticism or feedback. And I've learned that throughout my career, that I have a few people in my life that I really trust. But other than that, I will not let anybody see anything until it's done, completely done.
That's a good way of going about it as well, because it's like a meal, right? If it's undercooked, you don't want to be serving it to people.
Absolutely.
I do have a question as well. Like, there is a number of celebrities that pop up in the documentary themselves where they're talking to Wayne and they become talking heads. As a director, how do you go about inserting those clips in and those interviews without it feeling like taking the audience out by being like, oh, that's when you have somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson and not take it out from the audience?
My opinion is that when you approach an interview, you don't approach it like an interview, you approach it like a conversation. You're just we're sitting here and we're chatting about this person that you revere. It's not, oh, you're Neil deGrasse Tyson. Can you say something about Wayne Shorter? It's an approach. And I think the approach always should be, hey, we're here having a conversation about someone we both revere. What is it? How did he influence you? Let's talk about that. When you have that kind of direct, just conversational, dialogue, and I approached all of my interviews in the same way. And I said, hey, this is not an interview. We're just talking. And what you find is that people just sort of relax. They're not you don't give questions ahead of time. It's like jazz and improvisation. And I think that in a lot of ways, Neil just spoke to what it was that he discovered in Wayne Shorter. And he said, I didn't know a lot about Wayne Shorter, but I knew this. And this is what really I discovered. And I had no idea that Wayne wrote a lot of these. I thought it was Miles Davis, but it was Wayne Shorter. How amazing. And he had such an impact on me. And here's why. And it really just comes through. I think it's very genuine. His response was very authentic. And people can sense across that screen what's real and what's fabricated and what was put in there because we want a famous person put in there. That was never the intention. It was just people we knew that loved Wayne, and Wayne loved Neil deGrasse Tyson. He was a huge fan. And when I heard that Neil liked Wayne's music, then I thought, gosh, we got to talk to each other. I think it's just the approach.
I think, as you said, it's like to keep it as just, this is a conversation. It's not about, oh, here's Neil, let's put him on screen for the sake of it. And I think as well, like, it gives that a different sort of audience member feel in terms of, oh, I thought Miles had written all these songs, but actually no, it was you, Wayne, is something that it kind of like debunks a little bit for audience members to show that like how influential and how much music that Wayne had written, and that actually the stuff that you might have loved from Miles would have had other people on it collaborating and creating it.
And Wayne was a very humble and an inconspicuous leader. He wasn't like Miles, where Miles Davis was such a strong force and so like a real performer and a less hero type of figure. Wayne was a gentle, thoughtful, imaginative, almost childlike, but profound, but inconspicuous. And I think sometimes when people are like that, they're overlooked. And people always want to give credit to the person who's more outward, who's got a bigger name, has a great business savvy or business sense, and know that, Wayne didn't have that. He was very authentic. And he said, this is what I want to do. He never veered away. He didn't try to go into pop music. He was obstinate and he had a lot of perseverance in his message and what he wanted to do. And he didn't care whether millions of people loved it or not. He was just going to do what he was going to do. I had a lot of respect for him for that. And my mentor was David Lynch. And they reminded me so much of each other because both of them had that same philosophy as an artist and this drive to stay true to their own vision. And I think it was just perfect. I mean, to be able to know both of them in my life.
Yeah, and that's just, again, I think when you have those opportunities to talk to people and sort of dive in and find out more about them, and in your case, do a 3-part documentary, I think that's always like something a little special about it. Just to finish the interview, what would you say is your favorite part of what would you say is your favorite story of Wayne that he told that you put into the documentary?
For me, my favorite part, I mean, there's not a favorite part. I love it all. But I think when he always said in Portal 3, when he talks about people marching on each other using sound as a weapon, and that the fact that he really paid attention to every note that he played to affect people's lives, That just gets me every time. And Play What You Wish For, Never Give Up, Jazz Means I Dare You. All that stuff for me was a culmination of everything he had done in his life to get to that point, to have the freedom. He was a very free person. And I think that Portal 3 for me, all the things that he was doing and saying, I don't know, those are the ones that touch my heart the most.
I think that's a very poignant and beautiful way to end our interview. Thank you, Dorsay, for your time. And thank you for talking about Wayne Shorter's Zero Gravity, which will be streaming on Amazon on August the 25th. Go out, watch it, enjoy it, take it in. You will learn something new. And on top of that, you'll be introduced to new music and a new way of experiencing sounds as well. Thank you very much again. You take care and bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.